and welcome to Interview with the Cosplayer. I'm your host, Marina Sharp, and today we're going to be talking about sewing for cosplay. So with us here today, we have Crafty Kiki. Kiki, would you mind taking a moment to just introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Kiki Nakarado. I go by Crafty Kiki online. I go by she, her pronouns. I am 33 years old and I have been cosplaying for about 10 years now.
Oh my gosh, same. All right, so to start at the beginning, as I assume you do with all interviews, it's my first time doing this, give us a heads up, how did you get started with sewing?
So sewing in general was something that I had always seen my mom do. So when I was growing up, whenever I wanted a Halloween costume, all of my friends were getting those store-bought from Kmart or Walmart or whatever.
Spirit Halloween.
Yeah, and I was always wanted one of those, and she was like, no, that's too expensive. So she would sew them for me, or if she bought me one, she would keep sewing it every year to make sure it kept fitting. So I had a Nala from the Lion King costume for Halloween for probably 3 years in a row, and it kept getting shorter and shorter and shorter on my arms. And so I kind of just learned secondhand from her. I wouldn't say she's necessarily a sewist, but I think she came from the era where it was you always knew how to sew just in case. And so I started with sewing patches onto jackets. I sewed a couple of handbags for myself and friends when we were in high school and stuff. And then about the time that I was in my 20s, I was oh, I really want to start doing this for costuming and cosplay and stuff, because anytime that we, had a friend who was doing a themed party, I had to be absolutely super extra about it. I was always the person delivering the full costume for it. And then we went to our first official Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con in 2014. And I was oh, people do this. This is I was kind of vaguely aware of cosplay, but I was never really this could be my thing too. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of when it hit me, I was oh, well, I have these skills kind of, and I like to do this all of the time anyway. Any excuse to be in a costume, I will absolutely be in a costume. So I was oh, this is where the worlds collide, and this is what I can do with this.
I love that. And I also love that you started out at San Diego Comic-Con for your first Comic-Con.
I think technically there was a WonderCon we went to, it was a Sunday of WonderCon, that spring, and then we managed to get Sunday tickets to San Diego Comic-Con that following summer, and then we were in it and have been going ever since.
So we kind of got into, you having the excitement around doing costumes anyway. Was there a specific cosplay that you would say was your first official cosplay that got you into cosplaying?
Yeah, so my first official cosplay was at San Diego Comic-Con, and I went as Ramona Flowers from Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Mm-hmm. I got the star bag on Etsy for Christmas that year or something, and I was well, I have the bag, and that's probably the hardest part of it. That was my assumption, was that the bag would be the hardest part of the cosplay. And so I was I have the bag, and I was well, I'll just build a cosplay around this, and I'll do that. And at that point, I wasn't quite sewing everything from scratch. So what I did was I went thrifting, because thrifting is where I started out with cosplay, and I still do for the most part, alter what I find to be more screen accurate. So I found the green army dress that she wears with the striped shirt underneath, and I altered that and hemmed it a little bit. And I was oh, I can do this. And actually the biggest part of that build was actually the big hammer prop, which I did make. I was really proud. And that was one of the things that really, because when we were walking the floor and everybody was oh my God, you're so great, let's take a picture. And I was oh wow, I wasn't expecting this at all. I think it was because of the hammer. I had made it it was 2 styrofoam coolers that my husband got from his work, and I just taped them and then just painted it and got a big wooden thing. And that was when I was oh, I want to keep doing this. When everybody was oh, you made that? That you did that? I was yeah, I did that. For sure. And then I was hooked from that moment on. I was oh, this is it. This is my hobby. This is what I'm doing.
Yeah, I feel that's the case for a lot of cosplayers.
Yeah.
You get that external validation. You're just yes,
I put a lot of time into this, and somebody's validating that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now that we know what your first cosplay was, and you've been cosplaying for 10 years, what do you think in that time has been your most complicated sewing project? And also, what about it made it so complex?
So I think there were technically like 2 cosplays that I would put under this category. The first one is my Captain Marvel Star Wars Resistance pilot crossover, mainly because I decided to go with the Rebel Legion like pattern that I got for the vest part of it. I had previously made the same flight suit before for a Poe Dameron cosplay and just kind of like skimped out on the vest. Like I went to Goodwill, I was like, where's the white vest? I'm gonna use that and alter it. But this time I was like, I'm making it from scratch. I'm following the Rebel Legion thing. And it was so complicated. It was like the most complicated pattern I've ever seen in my life, because if you're not familiar with it, it's like a regular flight vest, but it's got like specific ridges on each of the lines and like this weird puffy thing that comes around. And it was just like a math problem and like geometry and like lots of like foam that you had to like insert into like specific sewed pieces together. And it was just a huge undertaking. And I remember it was one of those things where like when I was done with it, I was just like so impressed with myself. I was like, oh, I did that. And like to my knowledge, I think it was as like screen accurate. Like I would think it was the way that for the most part, if anybody's getting like approved by like Rebel Legion or whatever, like that's what, granted it wasn't the same colors and it was like the Captain Marvel crossover part, but I was like, oh, like I can do like that quality of stuff. And like, that was really kind of validating for me too, that I was like, I had been for the most part, kind of just like winging it for a lot of things. I'll get a lot of patterns and I'll like alter patterns for things. But this was the first time where I was like, I have to follow this pattern exactly the way that it says it will, or else I'm not gonna be able to do this. And so there was a lot of pieces that were constructed together to create like 40% of the cosplay. Like it wasn't even like the big full flight suit, which was surprisingly easy compared to the vest. Like it surprises you like what things are gonna be complicated and what things aren't going to be with a costume. So I was really pleased with that. And then I would say this year also for Halloween, I made a Sally dress.
Yeah,
like completely
beautiful.
Thank you. It was, I really wanted to make it like authentically patchwork instead of just like finding like the Sally print like somewhere and like finding that, which is like, there's no problem with that. It's just like, I really wanted to make it like this, like I said, authentic kind of patchwork dress in the same way that like Sally is a patchwork doll. And I also took a pattern that was kind of like Edwardian Victorian dress rather than like the typical dress. And so that was complicated in trying to take an original pattern and concept and applying it to a completely different style of dress. And then also just like cutting out all of the pieces, and like I had to like cut out the dots on the dot part and sew on the dots. And then I did hand sewing with yarn for the first time. To create like the stitch effect on the dress, because regular thread would just be like invisible with like the perspective of it. So there was a lot of moving pieces with that part and just like pattern pieces that I hadn't quite worked with yet. So that one came together very last minute. I almost cried, I didn't. I cried afterwards, but I did not cry during the process of it. And that was a bump that I came over to, was that I was trying to make it all one dress and like it wasn't quite working with the measurements. And so I ended up making it 2 pieces. So it was like a blouse tucked into a skirt, and it ended up looking fine. It just was one of those things where like I learned, was like at this point in like 10 years of sewing, I'm like, oh, I can improvise when I need to, or I know like now like when I can make changes and how to make those changes and make it work still without completely throwing the entire project in the garbage. So I was really proud of that one, just because it was just such a multi-piece process to create the final product. So I was really proud of that one.
I feel like what I'm getting from sewing cosplays is that it's a lot of math and it's blood, sweat, and tears. Maybe not in that order, but it's all in there.
It is, and I am not a math person, which is why I teach English. So yeah, it's one of those things where I've really had to hone a lot of skills that I wasn't expecting to have to hone in my early 30s, so.
So do you find that sewing your cosplays in particular, like making it yourself, is something that has made you feel more connected to the characters that you cosplay as?
I would say so. I think there's just a little extra heart that's put into it. It's kind of like a homemade meal, in that it's just like, there's an ownership to it. As far as like embodying the character is concerned, I think that happens more like when you put it on. But I mean, I do find myself getting connected with the characters because what I usually do is if I'm creating a particular character and I'm just like in my house working on it, I will often put on either like the film that it's associated with or the show that it's associated with. I'm looking at a lot of reference pictures, like scouring the internet for like certain, like finding the back side of Sally's dress is impossible.
Yeah.
Like there are no pictures that exist online, and she has such long hair. Yeah. So you find yourself just researching the character a lot when you are making it from scratch as opposed to ordering it or getting it, you know, fitted for yourself. So I think in the time that you put into it, there's just an automatic connection that you get with the character. Spiritually, maybe, sure. I think it depends on the character, but for the most part, it's really just being able to find the knowledge behind the character to help put that into like the technical pieces of it as well. Yeah.
So in that line of you know, putting kind of like your heart into these cosplays, what kind of personal touches do you feel that you add to your cosplays?
I think that entirely depends on the character and what I'm doing. I think a lot of it comes from the fact that I really like to explore and play along with my own designs or like variations of a character. So sometimes when you're translating something, especially if it's animated or like illustrated, that doesn't quite work in real life. And so trying to find real life ways to tackle particular like straps or gravity. There are a lot of things, especially in like superhero like cosplaying, that just like don't translate really well. And then also adjusting to like my body type is like not the same as like Brie Larson's or something like that. So I think the way that I'm able to add a little bit of something that is my own creative design to it, I think is like a little bit more of my ownership to it. And I like to have fun with it too. That's one of the reasons why I haven't really been focusing on a lot of like screen accurate cosplays, because one, like, as I mentioned with the vest, it's very difficult. And two, I like the design part of it. Like a lot of what I enjoy about making things is being able to come up with an idea myself. As much as I love certain characters and want to cosplay like that specific design, I think in a past life, I might have gotten into fashion or something like that, because I really do enjoy kind of creating conceptual things and
then being able to like bring that to life.
Yeah, and I think that's why I do a lot of mashup cosplays, is because it's kind of a challenge of bringing two designs together and making it your own, but still making the characters recognizable individually. So that's kind of why I like doing it. And I like wordplay, so that's why Sailor Moon Knight came to be and stuff like that. So I don't know, I definitely like the design part of it, and like that's where I find my individuality in it, is being able to say something like, oh well, that part of it, like that's all me, that's me, I did that. So I like that.
When it comes to, you know, making these cosplays kind of conceptually from the ground up, what makes you look at a character or their design and think, I want to cosplay that?
That's a really good question. A lot of it comes down to like, that's just a really cool costume. And I'm just like, I want to wear that. I want to own that. I really like empowering cosplays. Like I feel like for myself individually, to get like weird about it, it's just like, I'm a really big introvert and I have like a lot of self-esteem issues and I don't feel comfortable in my skin a lot of the time. But like when I'm in cosplay, like that completely changes. And so like being able to embody characters that I think lend me strength and like attitude and confidence is something that I often am drawn to. Like I like powerful women and like being able to cosplay them. Other than that, I do like just sometimes the silliness of it all. Like my friend and I were clickers from The Last of Us for WonderCon last year, and that was just like, okay, this sounds absurd to make, and who would even attempt this other than professionals in special effects makeup? And so we were like, why not? Let's do it. So a lot of it is just kind of like figuring out how it works. Like I like the puzzle of it too. It's just being like, oh, that's a really cool costume. How do I make that? Like, how did they make that? And figuring out like, well, I'm gonna do it myself. And there's a sense of like hubris and pride that plays along with it too. But I like being able to figure things out and put things together in the same way that I really enjoy puzzles and like jigsaw puzzles and stuff. Because that's all sewing really is inherently. It's just like, it's a puzzle. It's you cut out pieces, you find a way to stitch them together, you get them to work. And so I enjoy that challenge aspect of it for sure. Way more expensive than going and getting a jigsaw puzzle itself, but you know how it is.
So you mentioned that you like jigsaw puzzles. You like the puzzle of how the cosplay comes together when you're sewing it yourself. Would you say that sewing your own cosplays has kind of helped you grow creatively overall?
Definitely. I feel like where I was 10 years ago and like where I am now is like impressive, I guess, for somebody who just like, this isn't their job. This is just something that I do when I have time. Like there's a difference between making something from scratch and being able to figure out like, okay, well, like now I can make sleeves without having a pattern. Like there was something that I needed to make like really big puff sleeves for. And I was like, well, I don't want to have to go like find a pattern online for that. But I had made enough of them that I was like, oh, I can just do this now. I can just sketch out a pattern. And like, so there's a lot of it that I think is just the skills really help with the fact that I don't have to worry about the skills anymore. And so I can take on more ambitious projects because there are a lot of things that I've just found I don't need patterns for anymore. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
And being able to have that kind of like inherent knowledge, just like kind of like in the back of my brain has been super helpful. So I think that's definitely helped overall with my creativity, is that I can, one, expand on it a little bit more than I would have if I was just sticking to altering thrift store clothes. And two, I can take on more ambitious projects for sure.
You are a teacher. You said an English teacher.
Yeah.
And I know that, cosplay can be very involved as far as hobbies go.
Yeah.
How do you balance like having a full-time job, and especially a full-time job like being a teacher, with cosplay as your passion, as your hobby?
It is a lot. It's kind of turned into a second job that I don't get paid for. In fact, I lose money on it. But no, I'm really lucky that the type of job that I have, like I do get summers off. So typically when I am prepping for Comic-Con, which has been like pretty much a yearly thing for the last 10 years, it just turns into my job. Like I'm really lucky that like I can just wake up in the morning and then I'm sewing, doing that instead of going to work. So like that's really nice. During the regular year though, like when I'm prepping for either winter or spring conventions or just doing things like outside of conventions and building projects, it really is kind of like that's just what my weekends turned into. Mm-hmm. It's something that you have to like definitely like schedule out. Like if I know I'm building 3 brand new things for WonderCon, it's 3 months out, I have to figure out, okay, by this week I need to have this one done. By this week I need to have this one done. So it's a lot of scheduling, it's a lot of thinking of things in advance. It's also predicting and assuming that things are gonna go wrong as well.
Yeah.
And being like, okay, well what's my backup if I can't get this done? I'm like, if I've ordered this piece that I know I can't make myself, but I don't know if it's gonna get here by the con, like what am I gonna do in place of that? And it is time management and a lot of improvisation, and when things go wrong, figuring out how to fix them, and doing things on the spot in that way. So I think I have also just established a really good, because I've been teaching as long as I have been cosplaying. Actually, I started around the same time, which is weird to think. I do the same with my teaching, as I have, this is work-life balance, essentially. It's like here I'm doing work here, I'm focusing on that. The moment that I'm able to leave campus and I just don't check my email, I leave that there. And then I can move on to other things, whether it's cosplay or roller derby or whatever hobbies or things or game nights I have with friends, and making sure that I just keep doing what I want to do without it hindering either of the situations.
Yeah.
Because I don't want it to like impact my work at work, but I also want to have enough time to do what I like to do as far as my projects are concerned. And then there's a lot of throwing in the towel, a lot of being like, welp, I don't think I'm gonna be able to sew for this particular con. So a lot of it is just also knowing like your limits as well, and being able to accept those limits. I think I'm getting a little bit better at that. I used to not be so much. So I'm trying to kind of keep that in the back of my mind, and just being like, hey, like you need to be able to breathe and you need to be able to say no, which is like really hard for me because there's so many things I want to do and make, but I know that I'm like, I just need to slow down.
I think that's the case for a lot of cosplayers, especially, I think a lot of us do struggle with time management. So the fact that you're like getting that nailed down is really impressive to me.
I try.
And I think it's also, it's very healthy that you're able to like know your own boundaries with yourself and like how much work you want to put on your own plate. you know, I see so much online about like, you know, this con's coming up and like, oh, I got a con crunch for this, and it's just like,
I try to avoid con crunch because I've done that several times and it's the absolute worst, and I don't know why we do it to ourselves. I like to think I'm not a huge procrastinator either. I'm a huge planner in general because of just like anxiety and stuff. For the most part, if I'm like 4 months out, like I have my cosplay lineup in my head. I'm just like, I need to know exactly what I'm doing and which characters like I'm pulling out.
Yeah.
Am I doing any repeats? Like, what am I doing? And making sure that I have the time dedicated to produce what I want to produce. Because I've done that too, where I have crammed something in and like the product I got out of it is not what I wanted.
Yeah.
And like that's almost more disappointing than just being able to like figure it out halfway through that it's not gonna work and like figure out a way to improvise with it.
right, as opposed to just like scrambling to make it happen and then it's done. It's just like, I don't even want to wear this.
Exactly. And I mean, I've had things fall apart at me at a con too because I didn't give myself enough time to like figure out how to make it work. And so a lot of cosplay is troubleshooting, and making sure that you have the time to do that is really important as well. Assume the worst. I don't know, as sad as depressing as that sounds, it's just like, you know, hey, like this might not zip up the way that you thought it was going to, or like there's a lot of extra fabric in the back and what are you gonna do with that? And hot glue isn't gonna work or whatever. So no, hot glue works all of the time. I swear by hot glue. But yeah, so it's one of those things where I've been doing it for so long now that like I kind of have a groove and I kind of know what problems to expect and like how to put that into my schedule. Yeah, for sure.
I really appreciate the ability to like do that, and I'm glad that we can be promoting like a healthier form of cosplay on this show.
Please do that. Give yourself time. It's the same advice that I like give my students a lot too. I'm like, hey, your vocab test is at the end of like this month. I'm giving you the vocab now. Why don't you like study it in little doses throughout the entire month instead of cramming it all Sunday night before the test, and you'll do better. I see a lot of procrastination in my job and how it bites people in the butt, and I don't want to do that to myself.
Fair. So in that vein of, you know, having advice for your students, I guess I would ask for some advice for our audience. What advice would you give to someone who wants to start sewing their own cosplays?
A lot of it is just doing it. There are a lot of projects that like I put off for a while because I just didn't think I was capable of it. And then I totally was. Like a lot of it is just like giving it a go and trying it and just seeing what works and what doesn't. Because you don't know if you're good at something until you try, I guess. And there's gonna be like room for error and there's going to be mistakes and the whole Ms. Frizzle get messy sort of thing. I recommend just jumping into it. If there's a project that you think is too much for yourself, obviously give yourself enough time to do that and practice it, but you might be more capable than you think. And there's a lot of people in this community who are really helpful and like really willing to give their advice on things too. And people are really, really excited to talk about their cosplays, especially if they're handmade. Like anybody who comes up to me and is like, hey, like I really like your thing, I will dive into an explanation of how I made it. Even if they don't want it, I'm just like, oh, well, you see, I did this. And I think there's something about sharing the wealth and sharing the knowledge and like building a community with friends is also helpful. And like not being afraid to ask for help. I'm not a fan of sitting there watching YouTube video tutorials. I don't know what it is about my like learning comprehension, but I can't do that. So I'd much rather have somebody come in and like show me, here's how you do the thing. Why don't you practice it too? I'm a very hands-on learner. That's something that I've also come to accept, is just like, how do I find help? How do I learn things? And being open to help and suggestions and people coming in and giving you some advice too. So that would be my advice, is take advice.
It seems like what we've kind of learned today is that cosplayers kind of have to be very multi-talented. You don't have to be, but it's very fun to be multi-talented and allow yourself to learn all these different skills and to kind of make it your own in that sense. So thank you for coming on and giving us your perspective on sewing.
Well, thank you for having me. It's one of those, again, like imposter syndrome things where I feel like I'm not that great, but then I look back at it and I'm like, well, I have been doing this for 10 years and I have produced a lot of cool things. So it's been really cool to talk about this. So thank you.
And thank you for tuning in. We hope that you'll tune in next month for our episode on prop making. This has been Marina Sharp with Interview with the Cosplayer, and we'll see you next time. Bye.